Good evening, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Thank you so much for coming. My name is Glenn Phillips, and I'm the curator and head of modern and contemporary programs here at the Getty Research Institute. And thank you so much for coming out for our conversation tonight with Barbara T. Smith and Andrea Bowers. This talk tonight is presented alongside our current exhibition at the GRI, Artists and Their Books, Books and Their Artists. I certainly hope you've had a chance to see the exhibition. If not, it's open this evening, and it will continue through October, I think. So I was really happy to put Andrea and Barbara together. They're two artists from two different generations. I admire both of them very much, and we've collected their work in depth here at the Getty in some different ways. In Barbara's case, we acquired her archive at the Research Institute in 2014, and we also acquired a major set of unique artist books that she made in around 1966-67 called Coffins, which to my knowledge are actually some of the earliest Xerox artworks that were produced internationally, although they weren't really credited that way at the time. I think it's really a tremendous series, and we have a portion of those books on display in the exhibition. In Andrea Bowers' case, this is an artist who almost every major series that she makes includes an artist book, often very unique or handmade, very small editions. And we've been collecting every few years. We seem to acquire one or more of those books. So we have a really interesting collection, and two of those works, one of them quite large, are on display in the exhibition, and the other one you may recognize as our sort of billboard image when you're driving in to the Getty Center. So I think, you know, tonight it's a very informal conversation. We have some slides we're going to look at. I'm going to ask each of them to sort of start by talking about the work that's actually in the exhibition, and then we're going to branch out to some of their other works. But it's also meant to be a conversation between the two of them. I'm just facilitating, so at a certain point they may just start asking each other questions, and then at a certain point you, the audience, will get to ask questions as well. I just want to note a couple more things about the artist book exhibitions. We do public tours of the exhibition on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. And on most Tuesdays for the rest of the run of the show, we're following the public tour with a little private session that you can sign up for, where we'll go off into a room and we'll pull out other artists' books that are from the collection. Some of them are books that are in the catalog that accompanies this exhibition. The catalog actually features quite a few more artists than we could fit in the exhibition space. So we'll be showing books that we can actually sort of turn the pages and manipulate for you. You can see how they are interactive, and in many cases, the artists themselves are going to come and present their work. Nancy Buchanan, who's in the audience, is going to do one of those sessions. Nancy, I don't recall the date off the top of my head. Do you? September 11th. So you can check. You can check on the website, and you can also sign up on the day of. We're limiting it to 15 people at a time, but we've started doing these, and they've been sort of very special sessions, because of course, you know, with this exhibition, we've done everything we can to make it absolutely as visual as possible, but even so, it's frustrating not to get to turn the pages and touch the book and see how it's interactive. So we'll try to bridge that a little bit. I also just want to thank our events team here at the Getty and our audiovisual team and our curatorial and exhibition teams who've helped both with this exhibition but also in putting tonight's event together. I want to remind you to please turn your cell phones off, and let's welcome Andrea Bowers and Barbara T. Smith. So, okay, Barbara, because we're going to start just by talking about the works that you've maybe seen in the exhibition, if you've seen it. And so, Barbara, maybe we can start with you talking about the Coughlin. Can you see the image? Telling a little bit about the Coughlin Series and how that came about.
That specifically, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I had leased a 914 Xerox machine, and it was in my dining room. And I kept turning out any number of different ways of using the machine to replicate an image. And I began to see that I was making books, many pages of things. And so the idea was that I had to figure out how to bind them and so forth. And as this was going on, I felt a tremendous amount of sadness because I had the feeling that my marriage was in trouble, and we weren't addressing it formally, but I really feared that my marriage was coming to an end. So a lot of the imagery that was in the books and other works featured actually images of my children, or the books are for my children. And so my family history is my father was a mortician and my grandfather was, and so death was, a kind of backdrop of my life as well. And so I thought of these books as coffins, memorializing a moment in time with my children. And you see the little round logo that's on that one book. The
silver emblem.
Yeah, and that was chosen to be on all the books in the series, and it represents times in one's life. There's, in my life, been more than one of these where you come to a place where there's no place to go. It's like this is a issue. There's no solution for it. And it's just a place in time that is, everything's going to change thereafter. And so that's how that happened.
And why the Xerox? I mean, that's not necessarily a normal idea to lease a Xerox and install it in your dining room.
No.
And in fact, I know we've been, we've had a whole research project going at the Getty about the history of Xerox art, and you can find certain artists were working with mimeograph at certain points, or Wallace Berman was working with Verifax, but I don't know of too many cases of artists actually producing, major work with the Xerox machine before you.
Okay.
So you weren't looking at someone else doing it.
No.
But tell us how it happened.
Well, it was, there's a sort of fun story. I had this idea of doing a lithograph, and I went to Gemini Gel, which is still is a lithography workshop studio where artists come and create great lithographs. And unbeknownst to me, it had just started. I didn't know that. I thought it had been going forever. And I took a drawing to them to see if they would let me do a lithograph there. Well, I was summarily scooted out the door because, one, I didn't have a gallery, and essentially you had to be famous to make a print there. And besides, Joseph Albers is working there now. And so anyway, I was so pissed off when I left because I realized I'd been really, what's the word?
Brushed off.
And I kept thinking, because I had been working at the Pasadena Museum as a volunteer. I worked in their print collection, and I knew a lot about printmaking, and I knew that I began to think about that lithography is a 19th century medium, and it's not the medium of the 20th century, nor the 21st. And so I thought, well, what is the medium of the 20th century? And I thought, it's business machines. So then I researched all the different bits of machine, like Ditto and Blueprint and Mimeograph and so forth. And all of those are essentially planar. They're essentially the same as a lithograph in the way that paint is laid down on the paper. And the only thing that was unique and different and a complete different technology was Xerox. So, because the medium, the toner is plastic, it's not ink, and the process of replicating the image is electronic. It's like photography kind of thing. And the ink or the plastic is bonded to the paper by going over heat. It's a sintered process that melts each of those little beads of toner into the paper. So I realized this is a completely new technology, so I leased a thing and brought it into my house, and it just completely took over my life. It was super fun, but I could hardly figure out how to get out of it after I had it for such a long time.
What was so impressive to me about this series, and here we have an installation shot in the current exhibition, although this is only a fraction of the books. I think there are, around 30 in the series. I don't remember the exact number. And here we have maybe 11. But looking at this, you took every approach to Xerox. You Xeroxed everything you could think of, from photographs to your body to objects. I think at one point you Xeroxed your breath, yes. which is amazing. But also these books themselves, they have this emblem that ties them together, but they're bound in so many different ways. They don't have a uniform format. Some of them are narrative, some of them are quite abstract. Could you talk just a little about this overall? It's like you were dissecting the medium in a way.
Wow! All it was that this machine is completely responsive to what you want to do immediately. You don't have to think about it for a long time. I kept finding different things to put on the glass, and I wonder if I can't point it out there really, but. I can't explain. It just kept. I kept having different kind of ideas. Like, see that pink one with those little slots? Those are envelopes that we would get in the mail about. My husband was an investment counselor, so there's these investment counselor dividend things, and so. But I put pictures of my children peeking out through those little windows, and the one up on the upper. In my case, it's the one that's gatefolded. That's a drawing of, it's called Hokusai's Wave. It's the Japanese watercolor, was it? Or print, block print. Anyway, Hokusai, it's, this impending crashing wave with this little boat. That's what it refers to. But this wave gets more and more perilous, and finally and so that became a gatefold that replicated the wave. Some of them are nostalgic. The one up there with, it looks like an atomic bomb. It is. That's what I'm talking about. But it's made with cotton. And I'm talking to my daughter. My hands are in some of them, and I'm telling her essentially, though we live in a very dangerous time, I am with you, or something of that sort. It's the one on the very top has the colored Plex in that box.
In the box.
Yeah, those are plexiglass covers, we'll say. And inside there's plastic that I tried to put through the machine to see if it would take the image. And it won't. so the image is all wrinkled, almost melted. And so there is a kind of plastic that can go through, but not that. But it became part of that book.
But even that sort of failure then gets turned into a piece.
Yeah. Because I thought I liked them.
Yeah. So, Andrea, so let's skip forward, I think, 32 years.
And a child.
Sentimental Bitch is also a Xerox work. And so, one of the things that I find so interesting is that this medium of xerography has had, it still in 2002 was very viable as an artistic medium. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, explain the components of this piece and a little bit more about it.
Sure. I mean, I think, so I guess one thing that started me making artist books and maybe making me a feminist, I realized we were talking, we just had something to eat and we were talking about my family and where I come from. And I realized that when I was in high school, all the young women were required to make, I'm from Ohio, we were required to make scrapbooks for all the athletes. Like, it just dawned on me, that's why I'm doing this. And so, of course, I make these drawings that take 400 hours. So I was like laboring. I was spending all of my time making these scrapbooks. And then they'd have this banquet at the end of the season and you'd turn it over. So my senior year, I had the basketball player, Frankie Joffrey. And I kept it. I didn't show up. And I didn't give it to him, and that's when I became a feminist. And to this day, I run into him when I go back home, and he's like, "Where's my scrapbook?" But his mother was so mad at me. But it dawned on me as a senior, why am I doing all this? So I think a lot of these books came out of me making things that were meaningful to me and things that I wanted to honor after all those years making things for these male heteronormative athletes. The reason for Xerox is that I didn't have any money, and I was in an all-girls noise band. And I was obsessed with punk rock. I think Sid Vicious died when I was a sophomore in high school, but I was obsessed with punk rock. And I was particularly obsessed with the flyers they made. And I loved the democratic aspects of Xerox. And I thought that it was so beautiful the way the images changed. And I thought that an image got an emotional quality after it was Xerox multiple times. And I was thinking a lot about having studied with conceptualism and how I was only allowed to bring my ideas into the classroom. They kept telling me that. Don't bring your emotions, only your ideas into the critique. And I'd go in there and cry. And it wasn't until I taught critique with Suzanne Lacey and she said, it's not a good critique if everyone doesn't cry. And I was like, okay, difference between conceptualism and feminism. So this first Xerox book, I did it right out of school. And in a lot of ways, it's very naive. I was just emotionally desperate for a matriarchal history of art because at the time, everything we studied at CalArts was mainly male artists. And I would go look in the bookstores and, you couldn't go to Amazon and order things. I would go to Arcana and look for books or go to all the used bookstores and look for books by women artists. And it took forever. I just didn't find that many. There weren't many. And so this was just me thinking, so Lucy Lepard wrote this book called Battlefields, Graveyards, and Gardens. And thinking about those territories as feminist territories and as matriarchal territories in reverse to the way we might think about those things in a patriarchal society. So this was just me making a book trying to honor things that I loved that seemed really emotional to me too. Mm-hmm. It's really, really simple. And then it accompanied another book, a really big one that I was talking about being in a band. I was obsessed with these zines called Bitch Magazine. And it was women writing about women musicians. And I didn't have any copies. And it was I started collecting them right when eBay came out. It was the first year of eBay. And I found one. And then I found another. And then I realized I was buying it from the same person. And he was like, why do you want these? And I was like, well, I want to make an artwork with them. I just think they're so amazing, and I don't know where to find them. And he said, well, like, I don't know her, I can't remember her name. I have to have it in front of me. It's like, anyway, she said, or he said, that was my wife, and she's no longer alive, and she died during childbirth, but I would love it if you would make something. And he sent me a copy of every one that he had. And so that's here. So that's the sentimental bitch part.
So on the left.
So the big one are all the bitch magazines that he had copies of. There's a couple missing. And then the other one is just my own kind of like, I don't know, emotional, kind of matriarchal. There are just a lot of images that were just personal to me, and maybe I was really naive at the time, you know, but it was just like needing a kind of like feminist history to give me the courage to keep making things, or a non, you know, I don't know, yeah. I mean, there's also a Felix Gonzalez Torres in there. I was just looking for other, I don't know, senses of self, just like people, women, and you know, yeah, that were inspirational to me. There's song lyrics.
What year was that?
Do you remember?
2002.
2002.
Yeah.
So I was just out of school.
What you see on the smaller book on the right, what you see on the wall is that book sort of unbound on the wall, which is another thing I find interesting.
I always make 2 copies of every book because, honestly, I think Americans don't read very much. They won't look at a book. And so I thought, and sometimes the books like are sculptural. Like I like to think about a book as a sculpture, and they become so big or unwielding that you can't look at them. So I like to turn them into a wall work so they can become massive, and I like to think about how they look like, you know, works on paper installation. So you take the pages and you just put them on the wall, and how people read them differently. So, and then the rocks.
What?
That sat in my backyard because, like, I didn't think well, you know, I don't know what I was thinking. That is the heaviest thing on the planet. That bluestone, I was, like, thinking about the gardens and the you know, the monuments of ancient times or whatever, you know, for this thing, and the layers like a book of the bluestone. Well, Glenn called me up. He's like, do you still have the rocks? And I was like, I do. And he's like, can we have them? I'm like, sure. I kind of didn't tell him. And then like the guys from the Getty came over to get it. I had it under my fire pit. It was like in the corner. It was all, we had to dig it up and hose it off and stack it back together.
It's nothing a little power washing couldn't fix.
Because I used it as patio, you know, yeah. Anyway, so it looks great now. Thank you.
And then your other book in the show, Labor is Entitled to All It Creates, which is also a sort of archive.
Yeah, this started with being frustrated with Suzanne Vilmetter's gallery because the rooms are so long. I don't know if you've ever been into it. I love it, but it's like I can never figure out how to maneuver it and what I could put in there. And at the same time, I mean, a lot of these books are just like, this is kind of how I start a show. They're like idea books in a certain kind of way, but I mean, I got really involved. Like, I'm a member of the SEIU. I don't know, I've been interested in labor. My dad was a teacher. All of his friends worked in car factories. They were all in unions. And at the time, and maybe it's changed, I was thinking that it seemed like, you know, labor was getting such a, you know, right to work states. This has been going on for a while. But it was almost treated as if labor movements and labor organizations were somehow ancient history. And I wanted to show that they were like crucial at this moment. They're still crucial, and they need attention. So basically, a couple of students, well, one of my past students from the University of Utah and one from the public practice program at Otis helped me go and try to find every labor organization in the city of Los Angeles and ask them if I could use their flyers in a show. And then I made Xerox. I had a Xerox machine in the gallery. And I don't know if you can tell this, like, I divided each group with I used just those like actually we're still using the tables in my studio. We turned one over. We got used tables, just folding tables, and put different colors of vinyl on them. And each different colored vinyl, there you go, was a flyer. And like, so in the show, it was literally like tabling. You could pick up their flyers. It was really nice at the opening. A lot of the activists came. And I just made tons of Xeroxes of all of their flyers, and you could just read what all the campaigns were. And then I took one of everything and put it into that one book.
So these tables are, in a way, the disassembled book as well.
It's the book disassembled, but with like lots of the same page in a certain way. So one of every one of those things. And then in doing this, I realized that so many of the labor organizations, they were Xeroxing so much that you couldn't read the text anymore. And because they didn't have the money, because this was when it switched over from like DIY Xerox to like digital, Illustrator. So I would have on Saturdays, a group of young artists would invite a couple of the groups in, and they would help redesign their logos and flyers. So that happened on every Saturday in the gallery. So it's a really simple book. It just like, I guess I like to deconstruct them and reinstall them and, and see. So the book is literally a giant table installation in this case. I think there were 3 rooms of those tables.
Yeah. I think it ran for about 60 feet total.
Yeah,
and,
thanks. I don't remember that.
It's interesting because it's this very beautiful sculpture. It's a book that you could read. It's an archive of a moment. I mean, this was in 2012. I would imagine that some of those organizations might not exist anymore, and there are probably a lot of new ones.
A lot of them do, too.
And in its disassembled form, it becomes this kind of political meeting point. So it serves a lot of functions in parallel, depending on how you deploy the book.
Yeah, I mean, I love this piece. Because I look at it, I love it because I think about all the amazing people I met through doing it and how I'm still working with some of them, or how I didn't plan on it, but I worked in them. Because it seemed like just a simple way, I felt like I wasn't doing enough as an activist, but it was a way to form an introduction. And it was a reminder, so many of these organizations showed up, it really meant a lot to them to be in a gallery, and I forget that galleries outside of the art world are places of respect and honor.
Outside of the art world.
People care about them. I think we disregard ourselves and don't realize that people actually care and love art, and activists actually think art is really important.
Great.
Yeah. Barbara, as part of preparing for this event, we started looking at all the other books that you had made. And I'm always surprised by Barbara because at this point, I would want to think that I know her work very well and her archive is at the Getty, and then I'm always wrong. A couple of the books you showed, I just didn't know about them at all. And so I would love to talk about a couple of those.
Sure.
And one of them here, so this is one that predates the Xerox books by a couple of years. And I wonder if you could tell us about it.
I actually have it here. Because we thought it would be so interesting to see. It's just this little tiny thing. And it's period, it's called a reminder. I mean, you'd go to some sort of stationery store, I guess, be like some kind of date book or something. And I just found it among my stuff, and I started making pages that exceeded the page of the book itself. And it's pretty much random. There's some sort of narrative in here. There's a picture of each of my children are in here.
Some found imagery also.
Yeah, lots of found stuff.
But then that's the same symbol that was in the coffins
That's
already
right.
in 1964.
No, I think we're wrong about the date on this.
Oh, you think it's later?
Yeah, because
Okay.
it says 67 in here.
Oh, okay.
I hate to admit it.
This is art history in action.
It's so hard to remember. I know I've said early like that, but then I'm caught short by the reality. But yeah, and even here there's something to do with my marriage, because this is an image of let's see if, yeah, okay, this is an underwater diver and it's a female. It's an underwater diver that it's a male. So that's my husband and me. And here's two of us with our grand plumage. But I love that. It's like your books don't necessarily stay in the boundaries.
And you kept using this sort of technique in a way, but not necessarily in an artist book sense, because I know in your archive, your incredible journals, which I actually do see as artworks, but I think you were keeping them as journals, but they sometimes wind up looking a bit like this, because you include a lot of materials that are sometimes related to maybe directly what happened that day, but then I feel sometimes they're actually these symbolic objects that you're inserting into the diary.
And sometimes drawings,
Yeah.
Well, I somewhere in there, I started making journals, and some of the very earliest ones are really great because they have these fiberglass covers, and they're not day by day, but just as something came up. And then gradually, I got more routine about it, so it's kind of boring. I mean, there's a lot of pages like I got my car repaired, days like that. But there's also my musing about life and art making, and awful lot of complaining about relationships, angst, heart-rending, and yeah.
Something like Reminder, did you show it to anyone at the time?
I don't think so. I just had it at the house.
Yeah.
It was just sitting around.
And were you thinking, when you're making books, were you thinking about other artists who were making books, or was it really a personal?
The only person
activity?
I did know, and actually know him as a friend, was Ed Ruscha. And Ed Ruscha became a friend of ours because we started collecting art, and so he gave us one of every one of his books. But my books are completely different in their structure and everything, but that was really fun to see what he was doing with all of his books. They're very sort of mundane imagery. There's a few that are narrative.
Were those clear? Were Ed Ruscha's books, in that moment he was making them, were they clear to you as art at that moment?
Sure. Yeah.
Despite how mundane they were, or
because they're limited editions. They're very creative. They're his view. What he chose to show was like nobody but an artist would think about this kind of way of seeing. That's what if it was just,
It's always interesting to the history of reception of a lot of pieces. And I know with Ruscha's books, some of them actually faced a lot of rejection early on, including from the Library of Congress that refused to register.
Is that right? Shame on them. Yeah.
So this is another piece that, I don't know, Barbara, you told Andrea and I both about, I think both of our minds just blew collectively in front of you. This piece I had never heard about before. Could you tell us about I Am Abandoned?
Well, I was invited to be in a show that was at the Baxter Gallery at Caltech, and it was called The Many Arts of Science. And so there was artists whose work, had both aspects, science and art, involved in some way. And almost everything was wall pieces. And I proposed to, I had been already collaborating with a guy who was down at Irvine a graduate of Caltech who was a computer guy, and he had come to the students in our class offering to help us learn about computers or whatever. And I got really interested and started hanging out with him, and he and I have collaborated on more than one thing over time. But in this case, he would come by and bring this console that you had to have and show me a program that was available called Doctor. And Doctor was a therapist. You could sign on to the program, and the doctor says, hello, can I help you? And then you say, yeah, well, my mother is annoying me. Then it picks up on the word mother, your mother, and then it says yes. And so you have this narrative going on that this is, it's a programmed by psychologists, and it's intended to help a person become aware of their problems, I guess. Anyway, so there's Doctor. Then he showed me another program called Perry, and Perry is a paranoid schizophrenic program that that has 4 levels of paranoia. So at this Caltech show, we wanted to. Richard by this time was in Boston at MIT, and I'm at Caltech, and we have a friend of his helping, and we have a console, and the idea is that first I'll start talking to Doctor, we'll talk to Doctor and so forth, and then we're communicating. This is in 76, I think.
76.
Yeah, and connecting by computer, which is really early, to, is that true? Yeah, it had to be, to Boston, to Dick Rubenstein in Boston. And so we're getting that going, and then the idea is to see if we can get Doctor and Perry to hook up. So Doctor is... And Perry, you know, the low level of paranoia is that he registers a slight frown or something like that. But it gets more and more aggressive, and the 4th level is he gets violent and leaves. So you're trying to see if these two guys can talk to each other. So that's going on this console. Meantime, in another room, we had an overhead projector that we would project these pages up so people in the show could see what's going on. And I had a chaise lounge, and one of my students was it looked very much like Goya's The Naked and Clothed Maja, you know, the Duchess of Alba. And so she was in a gown like the Duchess of Alba, clothed, and we projected on her the Duchess of Alba naked, and she was chewing gum, and the idea of the abandonment is that I was dealing with how men get so super involved with their toys that the women in their lives are completely left out. I mean, you know, men and their toys is really what it was about. And so she represents the female point of view, and she's getting more and more annoyed, and this guy is working at the console, and they're getting them together and all this. And she comes in and sits in his lap and tries to seduce him. So that's the piece itself. Now, this book is the narrative, the whole thing that was...
The transcript.
The transcript, that's actually came right off of them. As you see the sprocket holes and all this. This is old-fashioned printout from...
So to paraphrase, though, you had the paranoid schizophrenic program talking to the therapist computer program in a sort of feedback loop, while the performer plays out the frustration that the man's more interested in his screen
but on
than
the
her.
programmers.
Yeah.
On the programmer, right? The guy who was typing it in?
The guy who's typing
it in. They're talking back and forth to MIT.
But who was she seducing.
The guy that's sitting there working on the computer.
Yeah.
If you told me that this piece happened last week, it would seem very relevant. Like to think that this was in 1976. I specialize in performance art. I have a really hard time placing a work like that in the history. It's not something. It's branching out quite a bit, I think, from what was commonly happening at the time.
Yeah, it was. And the other thing that happened that evening was that all the other work was wall pieces, and pretty soon the curator, David Smith, I think, he got very annoyed at what we were doing.
Really?
And he came and asked me if I would close it down, and I said, why? And finally I don't, to this day I don't know why. And finally I said, no, I wouldn't.
But did he curate? Did he put you in the show?
Yes. And finally he turned off the power.
Wow.
And so I never spoke to him for years and years and years. And finally I saw him at, Sue Dakin knew him, we got together. And I, to this day, I don't remember, I don't know why he did it. I think I was upstaging, all the wall pieces or something. I don't know.
And so this book, has it, I haven't actually physically seen the book. Has it ever been exhibited?
No.
Yeah.
Has it? No. No. Yeah. I have another, Dick Rubenstein, the computer guy, he made me a book that's like that has every conceivable combination of 4 letters.
Oh, really?
So so you can go through and find my BARB barb, or you can find, it's about so thick like that. It's fun.
Wow. Andrea, you have often yourself gone back to the 1960s and 70s, and particularly the history of activism as kind of a source material for projects.
Yeah, particularly I would say early on, like maybe in the 2000s, not the... I think this period of time was a period of becoming political and pushing myself to get to sort of understand what these activists were doing and questioning my ethics about what they were doing. So this was one of the second pieces I made. I mean, not this book, but this subject matter. It was one of the major bodies of work I made, pretty much right out of grad school. And it was 3 women called the Army of 3, and it was prior to Roe versus Wade. They were in Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they were fighting to make abortion legal by very extreme means sometimes. And one of the women was Pat McGinnis, and a friend of mine was trying to write a book about Pat, and she's like, would you come up and videotape her? And I did with one of the other women. And so while I was at Pat's house, Pat, every cause was hers. Every Sunday, I went up on a Sunday, and in Oakland, there's a pond, a pond or something, and she was by herself marching around the pond with some issue. She was working with, sex workers. She was saving animals, so her whole house was filled with animals. So she had these columns of Xeroxes and letters, columns, and they were all in plastic bags because the cats peed on them. So they were all in plastic bags. And I was like, Pat, what are those? And she said, well, we did this thing. We had a letter when we knew that abortion was legal was illegal in the United States, so we went to Mexico and we found doctors who would give safe abortions, and we had a list of them that if people wrote us letters, we would send it out to them. And these are all the letters. And so I was like, can I have some of them? Okay, here's 7. I think I gave her like $50, and I said, Xerox as many as you can. And so I made I was going to do all this other stuff, but I ended up making a whole body of work based on these letters. And she had crossed out all the names. There was no way to know who anybody was. And for me, it was like, I was so privileged that I grew up in a time when abortion was legal. I didn't even understand what Roe versus Wade was, or how privileged I was. And so going back to this history, but so I made a big book of all these letters, and there's like wrapping paper, beautiful handmade paper between each page. But this is the secret book. So there was stuff that these activists did that to me at the time, and I tried to make it nice and happy so you can't tell, that they did, that at the time I made the first body of work, I kind of hid this information. And there was no reason to hide it, but I didn't have the courage to display it. So a lot of these, so Pat also made the craziest, political cartoons. And she'd constantly send them to me. And, she knew I was making these books, and she'd love that I'd Xerox them really big and blow them up. And then it became a wall work. But a lot of the material, these are like all of her political graphics, which were outrageous. But there's a lot of articles or flyers. Some of the members were purposely trying to they were teaching self-induced abortion. I think it was more of a performative thing to try to get the police to come to arrest them. Like, nobody could try, like what happened with Roe versus Wade, women were literally trying to get arrested so they could try to get a case to the Supreme Court. And it was just, I admire them so much, but as a young woman, I was kind of afraid of some of the radicality that they did. And after a couple of years, I was like, oh, I'm ridiculous. This is ridiculous. They were amazing. And so I took all that stuff that I kind of left out of the first show and put it back in because she had given it to me. It deserved, and it was really about me coming to terms with letting this stuff be out there in a certain way, I guess. What happens is I do a lot of videos where I interview a lot of activists, and then they go like, oh, like they always have like little cardboard boxes of archives, and I'll say, do you want me to scan them? And then I'll give them all the scans back, and I ask permission to use them. And so this is kind of what this is. It was just, but it started with her, it started from her going to, maybe it's $25, I can't remember, it was a long time ago, just going to Kinko's and then sending me big envelopes filled with stuff. So, So anyway, they were an amazing group. And and I think they were kind of, she talked about when, pro-abortion turned to pro-choice, all the graphics and the colors turned to flowers and happy, bubbly stuff. And she said that's when a lot of the kind of corporate feminists came in, and she felt like the movement lost its radicality. And it made me think a lot about design not being neutral, and made me think a lot about modernism. So a lot of the wrapping paper was me thinking about how designs are gendered, that every design is political. Every abstract composition has a politic. And that's an obvious idea, but at the time it was really important to me in a way.
And this book is in the collection at the Research Institute, so it's possible to come and read it if anyone wants to. How are we on time? I have no sense. Okay.
They always say that, what does that mean?
Barbara, we were talking about a book project that you're working on right now. I don't know if it's an artist, but are you willing to talk about it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I did a performance in 1973 that's become very controversial, and also the worst part of it is it's been totally misrepresented by the writers that have written about it. And it's a piece that was called Feed Me, and it was my Me Too moment, actually. I took a room. I was part of a show that was up at the Museum of Conceptual Art in San Francisco, Tom Marioni's space, and it was a piece that went on all night, and there was a number of other actions happening at the same time all night, but the piece was that I was in this small room. It was a women's restroom, and I was in there naked, sitting on a mattress on the floor with a rug on it like this, and all around the room there was different ways that people could feed me, like with a massage or food or tea or books or music or so forth. And a voice over and over again said, "Feed me, feed me." So the rumor went around that I didn't start, but it was kind of, I guess, self-evident, but the rumor went around that I was going to make love with any man that came into the room. And so a long line of people formed, and mostly men, and they came into the room one at a time with that notion in their head, and then they had to figure out what the piece was really about, because I was not forthcoming at all. I was simply sitting there. Now, the misunderstanding is that since there was no way of knowing what was going on in the room, in some sense it's forgivable, but it also demonstrates the entire patriarchal view of the world. But the misunderstanding was that I was lying there like an odalisque waiting to be screwed, and that's the way it was written up over and over again, and I get so just downhearted about it that I didn't really know. We didn't know what to do about it. Anytime the piece is in an exhibition, there's a couple images, and then we require there's a text that accurately describes what happens in the piece. But, that's just one little moment, and not everybody reads that, and the overriding view was erroneous. So I engaged in a conversation with some of the writers that have written about my work, and on email, and said, what am I going to do? And the conversation is really interesting, and it went back and forth, and the upshot of it was there's not really much you can do. The only thing you can do is every time you read something that's wrong, you call the writer up and tell her that she's made a mistake. And the worst happened when I called up. There's a State of Mind catalog that was erroneous, and I called up Connie Llewellyn, who wrote the review, and I said, "This is wrong." And she said, "Oh, well, we can't do anything about it. You have to wait until the book is republished." Well, that will never happen. And so there's this constant problem that's unfixable. So I did a performance that was called What You Need to Know, and it was a conversation with myself and the audience, and it was talking about this very issue. And that's still ephemeral, although all the people in the room got it straight. And finally, we decided I'll publish a book, and the book is going to follow the trajectory of this whole thing, of how it started, what happened, people that have been in the piece, what they say, the writings that have been written about it, the conversation between the writers and me, and finally the performance, and finally a wrap-up about it. And thus we have a concrete object that can persist over time. It's not ephemeral, and it will have an accurate view of this thing. And so that's what's we're working on. We're close to getting it published.
Who are you doing it with?
Well, I don't know if she's, Kate, are you here? Yeah, Kate back there is my video editor, and we're doing it together. And I think what's the Typecraft is going to publish it, and like that. It's just hovering there. Very close, though. It's fighting back.
I'm ready.
And see, the piece is, it's me too. I'm talking about in that piece that my experience with men after I got divorced, because I was extremely naive, you talk about naive, I was naive. I had no idea about the ways of the world and how men treat women, and I was constantly being objectified. I was constantly being hustled, traveling around Europe, everywhere I went, and I absolutely didn't know how to handle it at all. And it wasn't like, in most cases, these were bad men. It wasn't like they were raping me. They were just walking me into the bed. And so I got desperate, and this piece came to mind as a way of turning the energy around. In other words, I had total control of that room. I could say yes or no. They had to ask me, would you like some tea? Would you like a back rub? And so it was me, and that's exactly the way it happened. And as I'm reading the text over, I wrote down afterwards, I wrote a narrative kind of down of what happened, and I'm reading it, and it was really, what's impressing me right now is how sweet these interactions were with these men that came in. It was so intimate because they were completely flummoxed, and they had to so then they'd sit down and then we'd start talking, and it was that we had no other agenda except it wasn't about who's a famous artist, who's made a lot of money, whatever. We were just sitting there, and it became a really very sweet interaction, which it doesn't happen very often. So untrammeled. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think we can open up to questions from the audience now, if anyone has something that they would like to ask. Yes, right here. If you could wait for the microphone to come down so everyone can hear.
Follow up on.
It's on now. Yeah.
To follow up on that, not getting to the specifics of what happened in that room, but more to the fact that an artist is presenting what they want, but the people that are observing, it's their interpretation. Could it not be that, all these men that lined up, it was their interpretation of your art?
What do you mean by interpretation?
Well, you presented your art in one way, the way you
what
had
do you mean,
it
the room
arranged.
itself? The room
Itself, the idea that you had behind it. Just like let's say a painter presents what he wants to display. And then the public comes and looks at that art on the wall, let's say, and say, I see something totally different than what maybe that artist tried to present to me.
What do you imagine? What do you imagine someone might imagine other than what they did? I mean,
No. You see, that's the thing. I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about what your feelings are about how people interpret your art, whether it's the books or performance art or whatever. How do you feel about people looking at them and saying, or coming up with ideas of interpretation that don't really match what you...
There's nothing you can do about that.
We talked about this a little when we had dinner the other night, that in a way this piece is as revealing about the generations of critics that have written about it. Except I think it maybe partly, if I understand correctly, Barbara, part of the issue has just been that there were so many rumors that took over the facts. And so in a lot of cases, the interpretations that people have made have not been based on what actually happened, but instead about
It's
rumors
not a,
about
it's
the
not
case.
an interpretation of, say, a painting. It's like saying a painting that's in front of you is made of pastels when it's actually oil. That's an error of fact. And this is the same thing.
But also, like, there was no audience, right?
No.
It was you and this
person.
guy, the person in the room. So it wasn't like you watched it, you walked in and looked, right? There was no watching. It was an intimate performance between two people.
So the only errors are with people who were never there.
Yeah.
And they're interpreting based on this pre-existing idea, which wasn't true. But they couldn't know otherwise. That's why I'm putting out the book. Is that clear?
Other questions?
Here it comes.
Right here.
It's coming. Oh,
Okay.
Hey, Andrea,
Yeah.
I had a question for you.
Yeah.
You're obviously very inspired by labor and activism and kind of the democratizing aspect of photocopying. But the two works in the show are like very singular, I don't want to say precious, but they are
Yeah.
precious, unique items. How do you reconcile those two things? And how do you decide to make one object as opposed to a book that could
Well, I think
reach
the
like
flyers
10,000
on the
people?
table were not precious. Everybody could take them. And that was maybe when I had enough ability financially to actually, like the gallery actually helped me get a Xerox machine and stuff. You know what I mean? Even the tables were used. I mean, I think those books literally came out of this idea of scrapbooking. And honestly, just to make some of the cover, look, even though it's a Xerox, the paper, the covers, like that was like all like the ones that have the pretty wrapping paper, sort of like the handmade papers or whatever. Like I wanted to make lots of them, but I couldn't afford to make any more. I know that sounds really weird, but I couldn't afford to make any more. And so I mean, I think for me it was more of like idea books and, and working with aesthetics and thinking about like this right now, like, like how art is a way of recording alternative histories. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about like, things have really changed, right, politically. But at the time, just thinking about in my little tiny way, right, because I didn't have any real art career at the time, but in my little tiny way, creating alternative histories than the one I was being taught or the one I was seeing. And so just almost like on a really small scale, entering that into this historical archive of books, right? These were the books I wished I could see that I never found. And so it was more like a gesture rather than like, I tried to get somebody to mass produce them. In fact, like there's one we didn't show that's like all with the source material is in Germany because some German bookmaker promised me to make it and it never got made. There are multiple handmade books that I tried to get someone to. So it was about that idea that like I could make my own book even though nobody would publish my own book.
Mm-hmm. And I think
that's kind of how I was thinking about it at the time.
So many of your books are coming out of these much larger series that are primarily drawings or videos, sort of other things. And then it sometimes seems to me that you actually wrap up a project by taking kind of the archival meat of it and turning that into a book. It kind of...
For sure. I think it's just a way of like showing these archives that I'm given access to or I can collect in some way in terms of the activist stuff. I don't know. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Okay.
Hey, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Well, you talked about when you were at CalArts, right?
Uh-huh.
And that you couldn't find any thing about women?
Well, I could, but not as many. I wasn't being taught it, and I would go to the library.
But what happened to the women's movement that happened there?
I mean, some of the books were there, and there were great books there, but I don't know, who's in the audience who was in the Feminist Art Program? Is anybody here who's in the Feminist Art Program? Does anybody know about that history of like, Nancy, can you talk about that? Can we give her a, because something happened to the feminist books, right? Yeah, Nancy's going to tell us.
Tell us. Yay.
Okay, so the feminist art history of CalArts has had to be resurrected year after year by groups of students that find out about it outside of their classes. In fact, there were two events that were organized by students. One, I'm probably going to mess up the years, but I think one was in 1999 and another one was 2006. It was in conjunction with the WAC show. The first one, there was a woman who was a graduate student in art, and she was working in the library, and somebody said, here, throw these things away.
Right.
And it was the archives from the Feminist Art Program, and she freaked out. And so she got together with some other women students, and they did an amazing project that was, you know, the whole institute was involved. They invited the members of the Feminist Studio Workshop to come back and speak. You probably came, Barbara. It was just amazing.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Beverly O'Neill was the provost, and she spoke. It was really exciting. And you would think that then the school would put that history on their website, in their promotional materials, but no. So several years later, I was teaching and advising some students, and I happened to tell Audrey Chan and maybe another student about, you know, the feminist art history at CalArts, and they said, what?
Jemima Wyman, she was there.
She
at the
wasn't.
time? Okay.
I didn't work much with her, but
Anna
and they
Meyer.
were amazed. They had not heard about this, and so then they resurrected this whole project, and they did another project. So, and I wonder when it's going to happen again.
So, so, you know, CalArts, I'm a CalArtian. But there is a rumor, I don't know, not rumor, let's call it hearsay, that the year after, right at the end, because how long was the Feminist Art Program?
It was only like a year and a half or 2 years.
So as soon as it was gone, supposedly all of the feminist books were loaded up and put in the super shop, you know, out by the dumpster and in the driveway, and somebody saw it and picked it up. But it was like definitely discarded. That's what I was told. Now, I don't have proof of that, but then it's sort of like resurfaced, and I think that's what ended up at Otis. I could be wrong. This could all be
Yeah, I'm not sure
hearsay.
about that. But the one thing I would say is that it's interesting to me that when all of this, can I digress for a moment?
Yeah.
All of this history is discussed, that the contributions of Sheila de Bretteville sometimes are not really highlighted, because Sheila really carried so much forward, and as the only female faculty member, and in fact, I think she was pregnant when she was hired, or in her first year there at CalArts, you know, she really did her best to change things. And
Yeah, awesome.
and brought so much of that to the Feminist Studio Workshop later.
So it was so odd, because I did have these amazing feminist teachers, but in a way, this history had been buried or erased for me as a student. And so, yeah, it was a weird thing. Yeah.
So for those who aren't entirely aware of what's being discussed, we're referring to in the very early days of CalArts. I don't know if it was in their first year of existence or second, but there was the short-lived feminist art program that was founded by, I think, Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Sheila de Bretteville. It led to, some of you may have heard of a project called Woman House, which was sort of the group project that came about, I think, after the first year. And it sort of blew up, and it closing down, I think, led to the founding of the Women's Building.
Yeah, well,
Totally.
if I could. Yeah,
See,
Judy
she went
Chicago
through it.
did the first feminist art program at Fresno State. She
Right.
was
Yeah.
invited to teach there, and they told her she could do whatever she wanted, so she had a women-only class.
Yeah.
And then she brought that program to Cal Arts, and Miriam Shapiro was married to Paul Brock,
Brock,
who
yeah.
was the dean of the art school at the time. So there was that support. But the women involved in that program decided that even at Cal Arts, where it was supposed to be so open, there was not enough support and freedom for the way they want to do things. And so they decided to get their own building and have their own institution. Yeah. And I'll shut up now.
That was awesome, Nancy. Thank you.
That was Nancy, who's going to be presenting her books on September 11th. And I also, while we're speaking with Nancy, I would like to mention that Nancy's archive is also at the Getty Research Institute. We're very proud to have it.
Buchanan.
Nancy Buchanan. Nancy, will you stand up so everyone can see? Did we already have another person
There
with the
was someone
microphone
in
waiting
here.
with a question, maybe?
There was one.
Yeah.
Oh.
I wondered if you could. I'm interested in Xerox and copying, and I'm interested in this kind of connection with these like very, very personal archives, and then copying and circulation. And I wonder if you could speak about the experience, both of you, of this kind of tension between copying something in order to make it available, and copying something and then not making it public. Because you both, I think that happens in both of your works, like the Coughlin books were not really circulated. And you talked, Andrea, about the way that you kind of censored this archive that you worked with. And
But then I put it in a book and put it
Yeah.
on a wall and showed it as many places as I could.
right, but then, like, what's the experience of working through those issues of private and public when you're dealing with a technology that is meant for reproduction and circulation?
Well, in my case, I would have shown the work, but I never had a place to show it. So I just stored them for a long time. And then out of the beautiful blue came Paul McCarthy, who was a friend and fan, I guess, and he put together a show. What year was that? Do you know? The one that Rosamund Felsen? Anyway, it was a show of artists that he liked, but who had very little visibility. And so in my case, I had all my books were in that one show. And there's things like, what if someone wants to buy them and all this? And I didn't even know what to do. And he suggested that we only sell it as one thing and make it so expensive no one will buy it. Because I didn't want, but so that was then shown. I know that, and then that was it until years go by again, and now the Box Gallery, which is my gallery here, did a huge and gorgeous show of all of the Xerox work, not just the books, but there's sculptures, there's wall pieces, there's all kinds of things. Yes? It's coming.
It's
Here it
right
comes.
here.
Hi, I'm Mara. I run the box. I work with Barbara, so I know a lot about these pieces. But I was just going to say, I do actually find something pretty interesting about the differences between the the books, the material in the books and the material in the framed pieces, and that there's actually a lot of more kind of intimate things in the books.
That's right.
And then the framed, because there was a whole series of framed works that also happened out of this that are more public, and none of those really have any of her body. Well, there's a few that have like her hands and things, but most of them, like there's other more kind of intimate books that maybe you could come and see in private here, but that have a lot of her body on them and things like that, and those actually got put into the book. So that was a way in which the Xerox actually became something that was very private, and that decision was made to be kind of put them. I always thought that was like a kind of beautiful thing, that somehow they are there, but there's something to be looked at, but they're also something to close and be contained in a way that's kind of formally very beautiful.
I like the idea too that you had to, it's not something you go look on the wall, you have to hold it.
You had to handle it, and hold it in your hands. Yeah.
But I think another aspect also, I mean, Xana, you mentioned Xerox as a reproduction medium that can make lots and lots of copies. But I think for Andrea, you referred to this a little bit. It's also a printing medium that you can get beautiful effects. And I sort of see, in both
I really miss the Xerox
I do
machine.
too. It's not the same anymore.
I mean, the other thing is like that I was trying to do, like, from the scrapbooking thing, these were really about, I mean, I came out of like the pictures, being taught by some of the pictures generation. And so appropriation was either a critique or it was a method of homage. So for me, I was trying to think of a matriarchal culture that honored each other versus like Mike Kelly wrote that Douglas Huber book, Let's Kill Daddy. And like, it's awesome and everything, but I was thinking about a generation that tries to undermine the next generation. There's like that book, there's that film on painters where Rauschenberg attacks like Pollock and stuff. And so I was trying to think at the time, and still today, about a matriarchal relationship where we honor the generation that comes before us, and just expanding histories that I couldn't find, right? So it was like literally making scrapbooks and honoring, but also I think these things do show. Like I think they show in the world. And then,
Now.
it may take a lot of time, but they get to show, they show a lot, they move,
Now.
they're
Yeah.
out there. But like, sometimes they're, push pin to the wall, but they're out there. So I'm not trying to make giant books. I'm actually making art for galleries.
And like most,
Sometimes, believe it or not.
a huge number of my Xerox work has been sold. It's bought now. It's
Yay.
all
It
over.
just took a little while.
What?
It just took a little
It just
while.
took a while.
Took a little while.
It's finding its way around the world now.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
That was fun. We have to do this again, Glenn. Thanks
Yeah,
for
but-
putting
yeah.
us all together.
Yes. Right. Let's do that again.
I know, let's do that again.